Welcome to the Atlantico podcast, where we talk about the science behind the Atlantico project, the Atlantic Ocean, and the human adventures experienced along the way. Here, we have conversations with guests from around the world who work together so that we can better understand, manage, and protect the ocean. So let's embark on the journey of Atlantico and discover the world that lies above and beneath the surface of the beautiful Atlantic Ocean. Welcome back to the show. Today we are meeting with Sonya Legg to discuss the very important topic of gender, and more precisely gender equity, in oceanography and marine sciences. We cover topics such as what the issues are with underrepresentation in oceanography, how we can help address them, and what role everyone has to play in achieving equity. So let's get chatting. Sonya, welcome to the podcast. I am excited about our conversation today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. So you might not know, but we like to start each episode of the podcast by getting to know our guests a little bit more. So I would like to hear from you where and how your connection to the ocean started, what sparked it, and then a little bit about what your journey has been and how it has led you to what you're doing today.
So I'm not one of these people who's had a long interest in the ocean ever since I was a child. In fact, I'm an accidental oceanographer. When I was a child, I lived in a landlocked country in Zambia, and I only saw the ocean a couple of times before the age of 10. But my father worked as a geologist, and so I was interested in working in earth sciences in general. And I was interested in weather and climate from a very early age. So my plan was to do a PhD in meteorology after my bachelor's in physics. But when I started my PhD, my advisor had interest in both meteorology and physical oceanography. And the oceanographic aspect of the problem he got me started on turned out to be more promising and more likely to lead to a thesis. So that's how I became an oceanographer. After I had my PhD, I decided to stick with physical oceanography because there seemed to be more fundamental unsolved problems. And since most of my work has been theoretical and computational, but recently I've also been able to accompany some of my colleagues on seagoing fieldwork. And now I'm working in a climate lab, the NOAA GFDL lab on the Princeton campus. So I get to combine my physical oceanography expertise with my interest in climate. So that's how I got to where I am today.
Yeah, so a nice journey, discovering kind of interest along the way. So today I'd like to talk to you about the issue of women representation and actually probably broader representation, in general in oceanography. So maybe to start with, could you tell us about the issue itself? What are the problems that we are encountering in the field?
Well, like many other scientific fields, women have been historically underrepresented in oceanography. And there's a huge variety of reasons for this. Early on, women were explicitly banned from going to sea on research ships, for example, in Western Europe and North America. This started as a superstition about women on ships, and then was transformed into a kind of excuses about lack of bathrooms and things like this. But finally, in the 1960s, women were permitted onto research ships in the US and Western Europe about the same time too. Then there was a kind of historical emphasis on the heroic explorer archetype of an oceanographer, which didn't seem to include women. And then a problem which still persists is pervasive sexual harassment on oceanographic research ships. Women, of course, in oceanography have had to deal with many of the problems that they have to deal with in other scientific fields, such as barriers to combining work and family, advancement structures, which emphasize a sort of apprentice model where you have to have one person who promotes you up the career ladder, as in many sciences. And then what we call affinity bias, where senior people tend to want to advocate for people who they feel a connection to, somebody who reminds them of themselves when they were younger or whatever. So all of those things disadvantage women in many scientific fields. But I think oceanography has these particular ship-orientated aspects which have made it harder for women as well. However, despite all of that, so legally, the obstacles to women's involvement in oceanography have ended in about 50 years ago. So you would think, okay, well, if that was 50 years ago, we have a whole 2 generations of women who've been able to enter oceanographic careers, where are we now? So when I was reviewing the data, I found that women are an increasingly important fraction of the oceanographic workforce. Almost 40% globally now of the oceanographic workforce is women. But there are very large differences between countries. So in the United States, women earn about 50% of PhDs in oceanography. And the same is true in China and several other countries. And they've done so for the last decade in the US. However, the gender parity at the PhD level hasn't yet propagated all the way through the career ladder. And gender parity seen at the beginning stages of the oceanographic career is not seen at the higher levels in academia, for example. And it's not reflected in metrics like invited talks and awards. So there was a very interesting study recently by Ranganathan and others, which looked at women and men getting PhDs in geosciences in the US. And men are equally likely to obtain assistant professor positions. But there's still greater attrition of women at higher career levels. So I think we have to focus not on bringing women into oceanography. Women are very interested in being oceanographers, and there are a lot of women at early career stages. We need to focus on what are the things that push people out of the oceanographic careers higher up the career ladder. And one question is, why is this important to have gender equity? And I think it's important because in a problem like oceanography, which impacts our society, human health and economies and all the aspects of coastal environment and so on all depend on understanding the ocean. And we can only achieve good science when we have a whole variety of perspectives examining the ocean. So we need to have diverse societal perspectives, which includes those of women. So that's the state of things as they are now.
Yeah, so they didn't really start really great for women in oceanography, being banned completely from taking part. Some progress over the years, but still some work to be done in maybe later career stages. So maybe to go maybe on a more personal level, can you share with us what your experience has been in your career so far? What have been the struggles, but also the highlights and successes as a woman in oceanography?
Yes, so when I started my oceanographic career, I came from being a physics undergraduate. And so I was used to being in an academic environment dominated by men. And I thought I could handle that without any problem. I was used to it, and I had succeeded as an undergrad, and I thought that, no problems going forward. So naively at that stage, early in my career, I thought that problems of gender discrimination were all in the past. I had good relationships with my male thesis and postdoc advisors and with my male co-workers when I was a student and postdoc. But what I found as I climbed the career ladder was that was when the issues started to arise. So first, there were these kind of structural problems of how do I tackle the two-body problem? So my spouse is also an oceanographer, and we had to figure out how we could have two jobs in the at least similar parts of the country. And then I had to figure out how to combine my family and my work life. And my daughters are now fully grown, and so I'm glad to say that I've succeeded in having a fulfilling career and family life. So I thought I anticipated those problems, but what I hadn't anticipated was the experience of finding that I had to work harder than my male counterparts just to get my voice heard. So, for example, if you're in a meeting and you bring up a suggestion and everybody says, no, I don't think that's any good. And then one of your male colleagues brings up the same idea a week later and everybody thinks it's great. So that started happening to me a lot. And in fighting to make your voice heard, you sometimes make enemies. And I've certainly felt kind of less collegiality than perhaps some of my male colleagues feel with their work counterparts. I also had to work harder to get credit and recognition for my effort. I would do something and then somebody would ascribe it to someone else and so on. So in terms of successes, well, yes, I've managed to have a successful family life and work life. I'm proud of the fact that I've written some interesting papers. And then I'm especially proud of the fact that in the last 10 years or so, I've been figuring out how to give back more to my community, use of all these advantages, and how can I try and lower the barriers for other people.
Yeah, nice. And yeah, as you say, you're now using all of that experience, and you are involved in many mentoring and supporting initiatives. And I'd like to know more about those. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more, maybe what their objectives and sort of activities are, and how you're helping people in their careers.
Sure. So the main thing I've been involved with is Empower. Empower stands for Mentoring Physical Oceanography Women to Increase Retention. And it was started back in about 2008 by Susan Lozier, who was a very senior woman physical oceanographer. And she noticed that while she had succeeded in her career, she had very few peers. And she was also worried to see that more junior women, after they received their PhDs in physical oceanography, were often leaving the field, leaving academia and leaving science completely. And she wanted to do something that would help retain this valuable talent in the field of physical oceanography. And she came up with this mentoring model. So for 8 years, I was the lead PI on Empower after Susan stepped down, along with Colleen Mao, my co-PI. And Sarah Clem is the coordinator of all the Empower activities. And we provide monthly telephone mentoring opportunities in small groups with the same group for a couple of years and then can switch groups. We have every 2 years, we have a conference that brings together all the people at the kind of same career level around the postdoc stage with some senior people. And the senior people can be both men and women, but the early career, it's only women. And then we have some other activities that are open to everybody, some webinars a couple of times a year focusing on professional development topics, town halls at major meetings. But really the core of the program are these small group telephone mentoring meetings and the every 2 years, this big conference. And we think we've made an impact. Now, some of the people who started off in Empower around 2008, when it first started, are now leading projects, even deputy directors of labs and things like this. So several of our alumni have won prizes at AGU or AMS. And many of our alumni, it's started in the US and it's focused on the US and the funding is all from the US. But some of our alumni have gone to Europe and East Asia and Australia. And so we're having an impact, a global impact, and kind of replicas of Empower being produced in other countries as well. So that's Empower. And my role has been in the last 8 years, was to coordinate the mentoring groups and arrange these conferences and then to represent the program more widely. So I recently stepped down from Empower, and I'm very pleased to do that because I think it's very important that a program like this is independent of any one person. And so I handed over to another woman more early in her career than me. And so we know that the program is going to keep on going with new ideas as well. So more recently, I have been at my own institution in Princeton. I've been working on an intern program to bring undergraduates from underrepresented groups into climate science. And we've focused on recruiting from what in the US are called minority serving institutions, which are academic institutions which historically have had a large proportion of their students who are African American or Hispanic. And those are some of the groups that are underrepresented in sciences and especially in geosciences. So we focused on providing a good salary and lots of support, and focusing on, rather than academic grades, on the enthusiasm of the applicants and their how this internship will make a difference to their lives. So then some other activities that I've played a much smaller role in is I'm acting as a mentor for the Asian American and Pacific Islanders in Geoscience organization, which is a new kind of peer mentoring organization that was started in the last couple of years in the US, because Asian Americans are underrepresented in US science. So what I mean here is that we have a lot of international students who come from Asia and do geoscience, but there are very few American-born Asians working in geoscience. And so we're trying to rectify that by providing this kind of peer support. I'm working with an organization called Polar Impact, which focuses on racial and ethnic minorities in polar sciences. And there I've been helping them set up a mentoring program as well. And then finally, I've also participated in many activities organized by SACNAS, which is the Society for Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science. So this is one of the oldest diversity-focused science organizations. And they have an annual conference with a lot of mentoring activities. And I've participated a couple of times in those. One thing I want to point out is, I've done a lot of mentoring activities, but I'm the first to recognize that mentoring helps people overcome the obstacles that exist in their path. And what we should really be doing is removing those obstacles. So mentoring is not a substitute for systematic change. And what I want to see is more systematic and institutional changes to remove the barriers to participation in scientific careers.
Yeah. Well, hopefully there are tips and ways we can do that. I don't know if you've already started to look into how we can remove those initial barriers rather than, I don't know, addressing the consequences, as you say. So based on your experience and your involvement through all these initiatives that we just talked about, could you share a few tips for women and also other underrepresented groups on how to navigate through their careers, what to do, where and who to get support from?
So I think the most important advice I have is to find yourself multiple mentors. And so what I mean by this is that in addition to your research mentor, who's the person you've been assigned to advise you in your PhD or your postdoc research, you need other mentors. Your research mentor can't provide you with everything you need. So, for example, you'll need a peer network, which provides a safe space where you can vent about the issues you're encountering and get support from your peers to get you through difficult times. You'll need advice about unique obstacles that people from historically marginalized groups face. And so for that, you need to have some mentors or peer mentors who face those same obstacles as you've been encountering. You also need role models, people who've already succeeded in carving out the career track that you would like to follow. And sometimes that's very difficult, of course, to find those role models. If you're from a historically marginalized group, few people may have succeeded. But reach out to those people who you see, who you think you would like to connect with. But at the same time, recognize that those people probably have a lot of demands on their time. So you also want to stay in touch with sympathetic colleagues who you meet at conferences, for example. Keep them informed of your work. Seek out their advice on important decisions and on your research content. The main goal is to try to avoid being in a situation where you only have one person to turn to for advice and feedback on your career advancement. So you need to make a network of many different people who can help you get around obstacles, and everybody will have their own area of expertise, represent their own issue that they can help you overcome. And you can't expect one person to do everything. And then my other piece of advice is giving back to your community also can help you. And this is something I found by being involved in Empower, that the feeling of kind of support and belonging that you get from involvement in these types of activities can be very helpful to the person who is providing the mentoring as well.
Yeah, so some very useful tips for those people in their early or even later in their careers. Just surround yourself with a big network of varied people that can help you through the various aspects of your career, and give back as and when possible. And maybe to finish or end our conversation, at least for today, do you have any recommendations for everyone and anyone who work in the field on how to help ensure that issues linked to underrepresentation are addressed? And what can people do at the individual level, but also at the organizational level?
Yes, so I have several points that I would like to bring up here. So I think the first thing is to routinely collect data. And by this, I mean that for everything that you do that involves bringing in a wide variety of applications and making a selection process and so on, you need to know what the data is. So you want to have data that's disaggregated by gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic group, etc. All the different axes of underrepresentation hopefully should be represented by your data. And this data collection has to be voluntary. You can't force people to make these things known about themselves. And it should be anonymous as well, but just so that you have the totals, what percentage of your applicant pool is women versus men. For gender data, I think it's also very important to acknowledge that gender is not binary. And so you should give people the options to choose the gender identity that they want to be known as. That means having men, women, non-binary, and then allowing people to write in their own choice as well, or to not say anything if they prefer. And it's only if we have gender data like that we can get an understanding of how non-binary people are faring in our system. So routinely collect data is very important. And then you have to look at the data. So you have to say, okay, the candidates we actually select for a position, does the gender ratio there reflect the applicant pool? Where is it that our gender ratios are becoming unbalanced, if they are becoming unbalanced? And you need to be able to look at the data. So if you make any interventions, you can see whether they've had an impact. If you don't have the data, you have no way of knowing whether you're doing well or if any steps you're taking to improve things are helping. Along with the data, I think it's very important to re-examine all of your selection, evaluation, promotion, nomination procedures, all of those sorts of things, to see if there are any gender disparities or racial and ethnic disparities, any class disparities. And if there are, then you have to examine your procedures to see where are those disparities entering the system. What can you change about the way you're selecting people? So one example is, many things we apply for in academia depend on having a reference letter from somebody who's more senior. And there's been a lot of research that shows that people write biased reference letters. Reference letters for men use different words than reference letters for women. And so can we make our selection procedure less dependent on those reference letters from 2 or 3 people? Let's broaden the criteria we're looking at. In some instances, it might help to make the selection process completely gender blind, anonymize all the applications. But that doesn't help with the reference letters because, of course, the person writing the reference letter knows the gender of the person they're writing the letter for. So we need to examine all of these procedures and see what are the changes we can make that will lower barriers. So, for example, in the US, at the PhD application level, there's usually a fee that you have to pay. Obviously, that's a barrier to people from lower socioeconomic classes. So what can we do to remove those fees and therefore encourage people from low-income backgrounds to get into science? So in addition to these kind of selection procedures, we need to think about other structural inequities that we can remove. So one example is in science careers, we often depend on people going to conferences to show their work. Now that favors people who are able to travel. And the people who are unable to travel include people who have disabilities, people who have family responsibilities, and also people who can't easily get visas to go everywhere in the world. And so we need to think about, how can we overcome that barrier to participating in science? Can we have more virtual meetings? Can we have more meetings that are in different hubs around the world so people don't have to travel so far? So that's just an example of a structural inequity that we need to think about. How can we overcome that so that everybody can participate based on their ability to do science, not based on whether they're able to get on an airplane and fly to a meeting. Something that I think is very important is we really have to work to eliminate harassment. I have never experienced harassment myself, but I've heard from my mentees in Empower how devastating harassments can be. And not just to the person who's being harassed, but to people who are the peers of the person being harassed. It makes people not want to stay in that environment, as well as putting people at risk of harm. And we need to do more to not just punish perpetrators after the fact, but make it difficult for harassment to happen. Academia is one of the environments in which harassment happens the most after the military, I believe. And it's because we have such kind of small, close relationships, one advisor working with one student, and that student needs the good reference letter from the advisor in order to advance in their career. And so the advisor has so much power over the student. And we need to find ways of diluting that power that one person has over somebody else's career. And that will make it harder for harassment to happen. We need to address unequal access to resources. For example, the resources you need to succeed in a career, funding, office space, computer time, access to technical staff, etc. Institutions need to make sure that access to those sorts of resources is fairly distributed. And then we also need to make sure that we're not making unequal demands on certain people. So this is something that I have definitely been affected by, being asked to be, the woman representative on too many committees, being the person that people turn to address mentoring issues and things like this. And then that leaves less time to do the research. And when you're evaluated on your research, that will affect people's career advancement. So we need to make sure that everybody is putting in the equal work to do the things that need to be done in academia or even in government labs or the commercial sector. But we need to make sure the kind of housekeeping jobs, the ones that have to be done but nobody really likes, are shared out equally. And then this brings me to my final point, which is that to work for equity, everybody needs to put in the work. And it shouldn't be the burden that's put onto the people from those underrepresented groups to try and improve representation. It should be the people from the overrepresented groups who actually do more of the work. Everyone, and especially people from historically overrepresented groups, needs to examine their selection processes for evidence of bias, make changes, address resources, make sure that when they're nominating people for prizes, they're choosing people from all groups, not just the group most closely affiliated with them. And one example is, if you're a scientist and all of your co-authors on your papers are men, you need to think about how you can change that and what you've been doing wrong, that the only people you've worked with are men in a field in which 50% of the PhDs are going to women. So those are some pieces of advice. The main thing is I want everybody to do this work and not just leave it to a few people.
Yeah. Oh, wow. A lot to take in. But I think your last point brings an extra question in mind is how do we avoid the kind of ticking the box, approach? Because I'm involved in many activities where people will organize a meeting or write a new proposal or constitute a new team. And then they will do that, invite all of their friends, usually men, and then suddenly realize, oh, we need a woman. And it becomes a let's tick the box exercise. How do we avoid this? How do we change that attitude?
Yes, so having a diverse and inclusive meeting, for example, that has to be one of the first things you talk about, not one of the last things. So before you start making your invitation list, you have to say, okay, what are our goals in terms of representation? So you'll say, well, what is our field now in, say, the early career levels is 50% women. So let's aim for 50% women speakers. Similarly for men of color, and we need to make sure that not all the women are just white women. You need to make sure that we have women of color involved too. And of course, one of the first ways to start that process would be to make sure that the organizing committee itself includes people from diverse backgrounds and perspectives. But that's not sufficient. I mean, I've seen organizing committees which are 50% women still come up with invitation lists that are 70% men. So, but then we realized what we'd done and we started again. So it needs to be an upfront goal right from the start. And you need to intentionally think about these things as you're putting together a team. You have to understand that it's natural for people to just think of the names, the people that they know best or whatever, people with whom they have personal connections. And that often includes affinity bias, bias towards people who share common background with you. And so we need to understand that we're all guilty of this. And so we can only overcome it by starting from the beginning, saying we're going to be careful that we choose based on the participation in the science, not on who we know the best and that sort of thing. So, I'm a journal editor, and this is something I do very carefully when I'm trying to choose reviewers. I have a goal of having, at least 1/3 women reviewers and preferably half of my potential reviewers being women. And I try and make sure that I'm not just choosing people from North America or Europe, and that I'm choosing people from around the world. And then I try to have a balance of early career and later career and so on in my list of reviewers. So there are all these different axes of diversity. And it shouldn't just be box checking. It's because we want these diverse perspectives looking at our problems. And so that's why we need to bring in a wide variety of people. There have been many studies that show that if you have homogenous teams, they do less good work than a more diverse team. But more importantly, it's just the right, fair thing to do to give everybody an equal chance to be involved at high levels in our field.
Yeah, well, Sonya, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today. Maybe you will be able to give me a few references to, existing initiatives, not only in the US. I mean, our project is based mainly in Europe, in South America and in Africa. So if we could have, I don't know if you know them, but if you do, I will add those to the show notes, so providing links to people that are looking for these kind of organizations throughout the world.
Polar Impact, for example, is a worldwide organization focused on people from racial and ethnic minorities in polar science. At the Empower website, There are a lot of resources, including the Empower Handbook, which has a kind of step-by-step guide. Some of it is a little out of date now. So, now we have a lot of virtual meetings. And so we switched to doing video conferencing rather than telephone meetings and things like this. So some of the logistics is a bit out of date. We wrote this handbook a few years ago. Our goal was that it would be kind of a guide for other groups wishing to set up similar programs. And then I have this gender equity and oceanography paper, which is scheduled to come out at the beginning of the year, but it's shared freely on Earth Archive. And that has many, many references. That would be the place I would suggest to go to for the references.
So Sonya, thank you so much for our conversation today. It has been a pleasure. A lot of information to take in, but it does mean that everybody can play a part and can do something to change the way things are.
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. What I most want is to entrain everybody into this effort and not have it be a burden to just a few people. So if we're going to change the structure of oceanography, we all need to work on it together.
We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode and look forward to seeing you next time. You can follow the Atlantico project on our website on www.atlantico.eu, and you can also find us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. All the links and information on the project and on today's episode is in the show notes. Atlantico is a project funded under Horizon 2020, a European Union research and innovation programme.